Alrighty. Today I want to talk about why the world might be coming to an end. Okay, I want to talk about not only like some reasons why it might not be ending as soon as a lot of people think, but mainly I want to talk about a lot of the reasons why I believe the world's coming to an end, like a lot sooner than later. So I just want to talk about that. So I think a huge reason why it actually might be coming to an end is a lot of the conflicts that are going on right now. I believe in the book of Revelations, and I'm speaking about end times in what the Bible talks about, because I believe that's the truth, and I think there's overwhelming evidence to believe that it is the truth. So in the book of Revelations, it talks about the Euphrates. I don't know if it talks about the Euphrates River will dry up, but it talks about some body of water will dry up. Okay, that body of water gives the it's called the Euphrates River. And I'm in this chat, and this one lady in the chat mentioned this to us. Like we're in like a whole group, and she says like, man, it has like the Omega symbol. That means like the end. Which I thought was crazy to think about, because Jesus talks about this. He says he's the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning, and like stuff like that. So like seeing the Omega symbol from like, and you really could only see it once the Euphrates River dried up, which I thought was just kind of crazy. So that's one, but you also have the wars and the rumors of wars that are going on. Like you have the Ukraine-Russia conflict, you got the stuff in the Middle East with like the Israel-Palestine, and now you have the stuff with the US is getting involved, and not only like actual wars that are being declared, but wars that aren't being declared as well. Like you see a lot of wars, like internal conflicts that are going on with like some people might even call it like a Muslim invasion in a sense. And I'm not saying like, oh, like Muslims are the Antichrist. I'm not saying like Jews are the Antichrist or like anything like that. But what I am saying is that there's a lot of internal conflict across all parties, because now we have all this division. You have like Islamic gangs forming in Europe, and that's strictly because there's wars going on in the Middle East, and they're fleeing to neighboring countries. So they kind of naturally bring in like what they believe in, and they're trying to impose like their beliefs on others. Like stuff like that. But you also have the Jews, which I know is kind of a touchy subject and a touchy topic for a lot of different reasons. People don't want to talk about the Jews because they don't want to risk being canceled. They don't want to risk Mossad knocking down their door or whatever. That's another topic where you have this generational divide, or that was a spider string. You have this generational divide between Zoomers, millennials, and boomers. Many, I'd say about like half of millennials believe that Israel is our greatest ally, and you have a large majority of boomers that believe Israel is like God's chosen people. We have to bless Israel. We have to stand by Israel, and all this and that, which isn't exactly true. God does say that He will save Israel, but you also have to think, like in the Old Testament and New Testament, it touches on this. The book of Hosea in the Old Testament is a great example of this. Just to summarize it real quick about what the book is about, Hosea is commanded by God to marry this promiscuous woman who I think she actually turns to prostitution, right? And that's to live as a living example of God's relationship with the nation of Israel. he goes into depth about why Israel is no longer God's chosen people. He goes into depth about how Israel rejected God, how the Israelites turned away from God. And there's like if you even look at the kids' names between Hosea and Gomer, like the names are actually representative of, you know, going into more depth about why, or like how God kind of rejected, or how God feels about the Israelites, and how God kind of rejects, you know, the Jews in a way. Said it's no longer my people. But however, he does talk about redeeming his people, right? And he redeems his people through the New Testament, okay? And Jacob is also mentioned in the book of Hosea. That's very important because Jacob is called to be is called a man that wrestles with God, okay? And that is encompassing all believers right there. You know, in the New Testament it says neither Jew nor Gentile, but all are made one in like the body of Christ, or something like that, right? You know, that's just many examples of you know, how the Jews aren't God's chosen people. And you know, the nation Israel is redefined in the New Testament. It's no longer just like a nation of Israel, but Israel is defined as God's people, not God's chosen people. Although they are God's chosen people in a way, but not God's chosen people like in the Old Testament, where you know, he delivers all the Israelites out of Egypt. You know, he gives them kings and princes and like stuff like that. But they're God's people because they are the ones that wrestle with God, because they are the ones that turn to Christ and recognize that Jesus is God, Jesus is the Son of God, and that Jesus is the Lord and Savior. So that's the main difference. And now I just want to bring it back to the end times, right? So in the book of Revelations, it says, it talks about the synagogue of Satan. And I want to try and get this right, but I might not get it completely right. So God talks about his chosen people. He says something along the lines of like, those who say that they are like my people, or those that say that they are like the chosen people of Israel, or something like that, are not, but they are the synagogue of Satan. And that makes perfect sense, because in the Old Testament and New Testament, it doesn't talk about Israel forming a new nation. You know, it talks about God forming the nation of Israel. Okay, that's very different between Israel themselves forming the nation and God forming the nation. Because Israel themselves forming the nation is what they're doing right now. Is they still don't believe in Jesus. You know, they definitively reject Jesus as the Lord and Savior, as the Messiah. This is a huge problem that I hear. They talk about like Judeo-Christian values. It's not Judeo-Christian values. It is Christian values. You can't reject the most fundamental thing about Christianity and pretend like you're kind of in like the same value set as Christians. But I don't know. That's kind of like my 2 cents. You know, they try and encompass it like, oh no, us Jews are the same as Christians. And I'm not saying like they're like this enemy of God, but they really aren't God's people. You know, and they kind of encompass like a saying in the Bible. They're like wolf in sheep's clothing. You know, they try and you know, they try and propagate it like, no, like us Jews are essentially the same as you Christians, which they are essentially the same, but their value set is not the same. You know, you can't fundamentally reject the most important character in the Bible, Jesus Christ, and say like, oh no, we got the same values. We have Judeo-Christian values. man, that's just not true. You know, and you see this by their lack of grace and by their lack of mercy, you know, and a lot of that was revealed just recently. You know, you have people like Nicholas Fuentes, which I believe me, I don't agree with everything that he says, but I'm just using him as an example. Nicholas Fuentes, you have Candace Owens, you have who else? You even had Charlie Kirk, which I know is very controversial. A lot of people say like, oh no, Charlie Kirk was you know, he was definitely like for Judeo-Christian values. He was changing, like there's clips that have come out shortly after, you know, he got assassinated, that he believed that Israel was going to hurt him, or Israel was going to kind of silence him in that way. So like not only has that come out, but also the stuff with like the Palestine conflict, you know, like absolutely Israel was you know, seemed like they were in the right initially about countering, you know, all these Palestinian terrorists that, you know, like struck on their Jewish holiday. But there's also a lot of skepticism with that. You know, I know even Charlie Kirk talked about this. Just to use him as an example, he said like, man, Israel is such like a iron fortress. I don't know how any like terrorist can really sneak in there. So like there's some skepticism about it being kind of like an insider attack. Israel has shown an overall lack of remorse for the Palestinians, you know, and they really use the media to their advantage in this way, because let's be honest, they kind of own the media. Oh, freaking tick. You know, they kind of own all the media sources, all the outlets, and if they don't, you know, they own all the banks. So, you know, it's kind of like good luck trying to get your, you know, funds out if you don't agree with their narrative. So that's why a lot of people are kind of turning to these independent news sources. But anyways, I don't want to get too off topic with that. That's like a whole nother spiel that I can go on and on about. But you also have to think in the Bible. Someone brought this up to me not all too long ago. They said every 2,000 years there's a major event that happens in the Bible. So I think it was from Adam to Noah's flood was 2,000 years. Okay. I think it was from Noah to, oh, who was it? I think it was from Noah to Abraham, and like that event was about like 2,000 years. Okay, and then from Abraham to the crucifixion of Christ was 2,000 years. Now it is the crucifixion of Christ to now. Holy, that was a big bug. The crucifixion of Christ to now, I think it's been about like 1,993 or 96 years. That's just go to show how kind of crazy things are amping up. You know, you have the Euphrates River drying up and showing the Omega symbol, which means the last. According to Jesus, he says, "I'm the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega." But you also have the years of every 2,000 years, something major happens. I know, you know, in the year 2000, everyone kind of was skeptical about, well, like it's 2,000 years since, you know, 2080. But it's not 2,000 years. It wasn't 2,000 years since the crucifixion of Christ. You know, 2,000 years since the crucifixion of Christ would be around 2033 AD. So everyone's, and not only that, but the narratives and a lot of these open source medias are pushing towards like 2030 agendas. Like in law enforcement, for example, that's a really good one. That's a really good example. Is they're pushing a 30 by 30 agenda. Whoa, turkey. A 30 by 30 agenda where they want 30% of law enforcement to be female. Okay? And then you have these sort of AI initiatives, which I don't know too much about, but I do know they're pushing for a 2030 agenda. So they're really, and notice how all this content is being pushed, is being gorged I don't know if that's the right word, but it's like, you know, it's being pushed to the masses in crazy amounts. It's crazy how, you know, everyone is starting to come to know Christ. And just in a few years' time, a few years back, like no one really accepted Christianity. It was mocked to no end. You know, no one was waiting until marriage. No one was attending church. Church was kind of seen as like, it was kind of seen as like not necessary. It was seen as like it's holding you down. But very conveniently, social media pushes this huge surge of what Christianity actually is. And then you have people flocking to the Church of Christ in masses. You know, and it also talks about that in the Bible. It talks about that, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's like when everyone finally comes to know and understand the Bible and like the book of Christ and all like that knowledge and understanding, then the end times will start to escalate. You know, like Christ will then come back. So in that sense, that no one can say that they didn't know. You know, no one can say that, you know, they didn't get a chance by Christ. So, you know, that's really all I can think about right now. But on the flip side, it does say no one knows the day nor the hour. But I think we do know the year. I'm not trying to act all prideful or whatever. But, you know, like really, everything's kind of falling into place. You know, the stuff in the Middle East is escalating like crazy, you know? Don't get me wrong, I voted for Trump. You know, I'm a registered Republican. But I'm also not super prideful to the point where, you know, I can admit that I don't think Trump's doing good. You know, the stuff in the Epstein files, not a lot of millennials and boomers would like to admit that stuff's bad. That stuff's really not good. You know, and I definitely was on the Trump train up until that point. You know, I still would like to pray for our leaders and that they'll lead us into, you know, better times, despite what every media outlet is showing and despite what the reality of it is, you know. But you also had that one AI image that I believe Trump posted where he kind of dressed himself in like robes and garments, looking awfully lot like how Jesus is depicted in like early churches, healing people. Like he's healing people, kind of acting like Jesus, and then he tried to like come out and say like, oh no, I'm like I try to make it seem like I was a doctor. That doesn't even make any sense. Why would you try and make it seem like you're a doctor? That's not relevant to what you stand for in like your campaign or any of your value sets that you campaigned on. You know, and I'm not even like anti-MAGA or I'm not even like super woke pro-liberal, but I'm very much like the truth. You know, I'm very much pro-truth. I'm pro-Christ. So anyways, I think that's all I want to talk about. Let me know your guys' thoughts. All right. God bless.